Thanks very much for joining us here today on this latest Basis Technologies webinar to everybody there in our audience. As you can see today on the screen, we're going to be talking about the topic of DevSecOps and how change automation in particular can support that kind of more security-focused approach and consideration in the world of SAP. And of course, this is just the latest in our ongoing series of Basis Technologies webinars. So if you are interested in these kind of topics, do please go back and have a look at our website. We recommend you do that. Lots more content there as well around the topics of DevOps and test automation. Little bit of webinar admin as always to start these things. This is a recorded session like all Basis Technologies webinars. We will be sending a link to the recording out to all registrants in the next day or two. So if you want to get a hold of that link and you don't see it for any reason, even in your spam folder, do please get in touch either via our website or there'll be some details at the end of the presentation. And of course, everybody is on mute today as usual in these things, but we would encourage you please to enter any questions you may have in the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try and get to some of those at the end of today's session. We're going to look to go for about 40 to 45 minutes today, I think, in total. So here we are, DevSecOps for SAP. I think an interesting topic that's coming up more frequently these days. But before we get into that, some other basics in terms of, oh dear, excuse me, what's happening with my screen? There we go. In terms of who's presenting here today. Sorry about that, small PowerPoint wobble. My name's Peter Yabsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies. As I've said many times, if you've joined any of our other webinars or sessions, you may have heard my voice before. But the more important person in today's conversation is my colleague, Jim Duggar, who's our senior technology evangelist, who's based over in our office in Dallas in Texas. Jim, thanks for joining us here today.
I'm happy to be here.
And Jim's bringing with him many years of experience in the world of software development and SAP in particular in more recent years, which is why I say he's the more important person in today's conversation. Personally, I've spent the last few years here at Basis working with and talking to our customers about how they're using automation to support changes in the way they run and manage their SAP systems. Let's take a quick look at today's agenda. Very high level. We're going to talk briefly just about the idea of DevSecOps and the difference between DevOps and DevSecOps. We're going to spend most of the session having a bit of a conversation about how change control automation and concepts around change control can support that DevSecOps idea, and we'll look at some sort of specific areas where that can happen. We're going to have a short end user story as well at the end of the session, just about how DevOps can deliver value in a real scenario. And then, as I've said, time permitting, and hopefully it will, we'll have a bit of Q&A at the end of the session as well. Before we get into today's content, I just want to do a quick introduction to Basis Technologies for anybody on the board who may not be so familiar with us as an organization, why we're here talking about these topics today. So we're a company that creates software automation that helps our customers to change the way they maintain and adapt and manage their SAP systems. And we do that by helping them to bring concepts like DevOps and continuous delivery and agile development and DevSecOps in more recent times into those SAP environments through our DevOps and test automation platform, which is specifically engineered for use in SAP and for this particular technology and architecture of SAP, which is a quite important point when we talk about these kind of automation tools for software development and delivery. We've been around for quite a while now, nearly 25 years, as you can see, founded in '97, and we are SAP experts. SAP is what we do. Our products are designed to support and work in SAP environments and only in SAP. So many decades within our team of SAP expertise. And we have a global presence. As I've said, Jim's joining me today from Dallas. We also have offices in mainland Europe, in Australia as well. I'm based in UK, here in London today. And we're supporting a range of clients all around the world, some very large organizations and well-known names who are looking to use automation in many different areas to help them run SAP more efficiently. I really hope my PowerPoint doesn't keep doing this, but anyway, let's see how we go. So that's sorry about that. It's a quick introduction to Basis Technologies and why we're here talking about these topics around DevOps and DevSecOps. But let's get into the presentation and the foundation of today's conversation. Jim, this is where I want to bring you in. I suspect many of the people in our audience are already familiar with the idea of DevOps and CI/CD, but let's just start with that to level set. What do we mean by DevOps? How did it come about? What are we trying to achieve? And without getting into it too much, as I've said, we've got lots of other content available. What's different or special that we need to bear in mind about DevOps for SAP as we have this conversation today?
Sure. So, DevOps has really been with us. Certainly, the genesis of it is, decades old at this point. If we look outside of SAP, the software development practice started to realize the value of being able to deliver more incrementally, deliver more frequently. It reduced the number of major defects from each change that was brought to production. It gave us more opportunities to bring functionality that's valuable to the business. And this idea of agile methodology, and then ultimately what made DevOps, of course, which was the tooling and the automation that brought together not only the change that we were bringing forward, but also all of the infrastructure management, all of the automation necessary to be able to deliver it in a continuous fashion. All of that kind of rolled up over an evolutionary period of time of 20, 25, 30 years, something like that, to become what we know of DevOps today. Now, if we bring SAP into the fold, we have a couple of architectural challenges in SAP. It was never really designed with this kind of methodology and this kind of approach to change specifically. But that doesn't mean that it can't be done. And so DevOps for SAP is literally the adoption of the same methodologies and a lot of the same ideas behind automation and tooling that we had outside of SAP, but then doing it in an SAP context, understanding the architectural constraints and solving for those within SAP itself, and literally modernizing software development practice in SAP to make it more parallel and more alike what we've seen in other languages and other platforms for a very long time.
Okay, great. So we're talking about those kind of ideas of being more agile, delivering more quickly, getting value out to the business more quickly, using automation to power all of that through the chain. And that's the basis for what we're talking about today. Obviously, the clue's in the name, but what we're particularly looking at is this idea of DevSecOps rather than just DevOps. So what is the difference between the two? Is there what specific things in this area of security that changes a DevOps process that makes it DevSecOps? And again, what about in SAP? Is this sec aspect, the security part, different there to in other DevSecOps processes? So what are we thinking about when we say DevSecOps here?
Yeah, so it's very easy as IT professionals, when we hear the word security, to immediately fall into the idea of technical security, intrusion detection, these sorts of things. We're going to talk about this a lot as the presentation goes on. But the thing to keep in mind with DevSecOps is that it is simply a natural evolution and a natural growth of DevOps itself, right? It's as if a bunch of security professionals who are responsible for regular updates, making sure software patches are applied correctly, being able to do things like offboarding and demonstrate that those users that have transitioned out of the organization no longer have access. I mean, all these ordinary things, right? It's as if they went and looked at the software development guys and said, hey, your methodology looks like it has some real value to us potentially. So what if we were to take some of your ideas, but then put them into a security context and manage security change the same way we think about software change? What might that look like? And that honestly is DevSecOps. It's the cherry on top of something that we already enjoyed and used and benefited from in industry anyway.
So we've already got this methodology, this highly automated tool chain of more rapid delivery. And essentially just what we're talking about is bringing security into that cross-functional process that we've created and adding that from day one, I guess, when we're thinking about development into the process.
In many cases, that's true. Certainly around the idea of software change, that's very true, right? but it's also just about being able to bring the same value that we've seen from DevOps, the consistent rigor, the guarantee that you're not dropping balls throughout the process, the ability to automate and make change highly effective and highly predictable. It's bringing that to security topics as well, right? So we've got something that works great. Let's continue to see how we leverage it throughout the organization. And congratulations, DevOps becomes DevSecOps by including more of these ideas in that context as well.
So I guess the key thing here, particularly in terms of today's conversation, is that we're not talking about a different concept. We're not talking about a completely parallel idea. If you're thinking about DevOps, if you're investigating DevOps, maybe you've even started on that journey, a large amount of what you're already doing is going to play into this idea of DevSecOps.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, that seems a fairly sort of straightforward framing to me. It seems fairly clear, but I guess the question begs itself is if it is this just general evolution, if it's just building on the concepts that have been out there for quite some time now in DevOps, as you mentioned, is why might our audience hear this term DevSecOps so often at the moment? Why is it such a thing that we need a new name for it? And I think, you know, we can safely say it's just because of the focus on cybersecurity and IT and in business that we're seeing in general today. I mean, do you think that's a fair kind of summary?
I think it's a great summary. And keep in mind that the reason DevOps became a thing for software developers is because it allowed us to be able to deliver change more frequently, but also do it at lower cost and with higher quality. There's really no difference here. We need to be able to deliver security. We need to be able to make it more present. We need to be able to solve for the challenges that the organization has in terms of keeping things current and ensuring business continuity. We're going to get into a lot of these topics specifically, but it is simply doing all of those and doing it with a high degree of rigor, a high degree of reliability, a very fast transport for change. There's no reason why we wouldn't want to use a methodology that helps us improve in that way.
And I think, you know, in terms of just framing the why we might be hearing this as a term and why so many organizations are focused on it, I mean, we've got a few examples on the screen here. I'm sure everyone in our audience has heard many of the big stories. Just in the last 6 months, all of these logos are from companies that have had some kind of security challenge just in 2021. So it just really highlights the focus on security and why we might want to be considering that in our SAP DevOps process, whether we call it DevSecOps or not. So the title of today's webinar, if we go back to the beginning, is how change automation and security walk hand in hand. We're going to talk about change automation today in particular, and how software change control fits into that kind of security focused picture. And although obviously, you know, change control doesn't solve for some of those things you mentioned earlier, Jim, that maybe come to front of mind when people think security, or maybe network security or vulnerabilities, it absolutely does support a number of the key considerations we would be thinking about in a DevSecOps approach. And we've got a few of them on the screen here. So how do you see ALM and change control playing into this DevSecOps story?
Again, back to a comment that I made just a little bit earlier. It is so easy as an IT professional to fall into, let's call it a trap. That's a little coarse of a term, but let's call it a trap of saying, you know, security is all about network intrusion detection. It's all about being able to find a hacker trying to break into your system, these kinds of things. And to me, the word security is a much more broad context. For example, business continuity is very much a function of security. Can I sell? Can I deliver? Can I make sure the business is able to do what it's supposed to be able to do after any given change? You know, anyone that's pushed you know, a roles transport in SAP and accidentally removed half the sales team's access to VA01 knows of these kinds of consequences, right? So let's think of DevSecOps as that broader mindset about change in the organization and ensuring that things like, can we continue to do business after this particular change, still makes sense. You know, now if we look at the context of something like S4, we're getting updates every year. It's got a much shorter sunset cycle in terms of support from SAP. We know that there's going to be vulnerabilities identified in the software, And so it's much more important to stay present in terms of our patch level and our service pack levels to minimize our vulnerabilities. And this becomes even more true because now we tend to operate SAP in cloud systems or even have cloud accessible front ends to these systems, right? And it used to be SAP was like the mainframe in a way. It was completely in the back office, and the only way to be able to log into it was actually come into the shop and use a local terminal. That is completely not true anymore. With our mobile workforce, with our home-based workforces, we're all using SAP through either directly or multiple different front ends to be able to get to functionalities provided by that system of record, provided by that system of business process. And it makes staying current on our software levels for vulnerabilities and other day zero issues that are well documented, it makes it even more important. But if we even stretch this out, we start to do things like, well, how do we effectively and presently ensure proper onboarding? And this is the whole identity management topic, onboarding and offboarding, right? How do we make sure that if we do have a new threat that's been identified, that we've been notified, we have a very highly rigorous, but also very efficient process to deliver that change necessary into that environment and ensure that we're not leaving an exposure that's now been well documented to the world, completely wide open in our own systems. And then I work enough with our customers that are in ISO 9001 environments or in FDA environments, these kinds of things. We have to be able to demonstrate to our auditors that not only did we do these things, but that we followed the process that we promised we would use to apply them and that they were actually successful. So how do we then report on that? How do we provide that traceability? How do we understand all the nature of change within an environment? So if I look, this whole set of topics, we could take maybe the patch management and the identity management topic out and say, okay, well, that's very security specific. But if we look at the rest of these, delivering change faster, keeping the business alive, being able to prove that we did it the right way, that's DevOps, right? Absolutely. And then DevSecOps just brings that same confidence, that same speed, those same advantages that we've adopted. Well, it brings it to security topics. And here we are, and this is why these things go hand in hand and they work so tightly together.
Okay, so we're talking SAP to this point, as we always do. As I said, it's what we do. We know it's what our audience here cares about, but that's a little bit general. So let's look at a couple of those specific topics I mentioned about where DevOps automation that's designed for SAP, like the software we created here at Basis Technologies, can support that kind of DevSecOps approach in SAP systems. So we've got a few, you might call them bigger ticket items here on the slide that we're just going to talk about individually. I'm sure if our audience were investigating this in their business in more detail, they may find other connections or other issues that are helpful or significant to them. But we're going to look at these kind of big buckets that I think are fairly common when we think about change control automation and DevOps and DevSecOps in particular. But before we do that, I'm going to start with something that isn't actually about automation at all, make myself a little bit of a liar from what I said about the last slide, because Jim, you touched on this, I think, already in your introduction. You talked a little bit about the evolution of DevOps, but how important is the people aspect in DevSecOps, in DevOps in general, in SAP, and what do we need to consider when we're thinking about DevSecOps as an evolution?
Yeah, such a loaded question, right? How important are the people? But let me back up from that question just a titch, and then we'll go hit it head on here. When I think of the difference between the way that I did software development before Agile and DevOps tooling was commonplace, I thought of it in terms of being very vertically aligned, right? So I know I'm going to have some amount of content and change that's going to go into any given release. As a developer, I'm going to program that change. I'm going to then throw that change over the wall to QA, and hopefully it passes, and then ultimately for business approval and so on. And we had this very, well, it's called waterfall for a reason, but we had this very linear process of delivering change to the organization. And it was very siloed as well. I mean, each team sort of waited for someone to press the go button on their desk. They did their bit, and then they put it in the outbox, and we moved on, right? When I think about Agile, and when I think about the way that DevOps works for software developers today, it's a very horizontal look at this thing. It's focused on outcome. Did I get the business the functionality that they needed? I am not worried about an entire collection of things that I'm trying to achieve. I'm worried about solving a problem for the organization and delivering them functionality that makes sense. And so on a horizontal basis across the team, we become very highly integrated because the idea of development and business approval to the functionality change and testing and all of this is happening in a highly iterative cycle on a very regular basis. And we're doing all of this stuff in concert, because we've got lots of things in flight at any one moment that might make it into production on a continuous basis throughout a given stream of delivery and all of these. But we all know this stuff, right? We've been doing DevOps for a long time. So there's no reason that security topics shouldn't be a part of this, especially when we're starting to talk about patch and change and those other kinds of things, where they could have a fundamental impact on the underlying functionality of the system itself. Putting all of that in context, if our teams aren't ready to think about working in this way, it's going to be very, very difficult to be successful with this approach, right? I don't think that's a big surprise to anyone that would attend this particular presentation, but it is absolutely the elephant in the room that we need to always be conscious of. We need to think about how we're organized and that we're going to be ready to work in this highly iterative, highly horizontal fashion, as opposed to just pushing work downstream through the organization in large chunks.
Yeah, and I think the idea that you mentioned of DevSecOps being an evolution, I've repeated it a couple of times already, but I think it's very key here because, especially if we're already thinking Agile or DevOps, we might have broader working teams, cross-functional teams for our development. We've got to bring security into that process collaboratively from the start. But that is, that's a necessary but maybe not sufficient condition. So let's now talk about automation in particular. And we're going to start with control and governance, which seems to me it's quite closely connected to just the general idea of keeping things secure as we change important systems. So how does SAP DevOps automation help us in this area of control and governance, thinking about security, Jim?
One of my favorite examples of this is ISO 9001, right? So in those kinds of environments, production control is managed by first agreeing on what the process for any given change or any given process or production item would be. And then it's all about proving to me that you did that process correctly. So control and governance is all about having the right people doing the right work at the right point in that workflow to make sure that you are consistently delivering change or consistently doing whatever you're supposed to be doing in a very rigorous and also consistent fashion. And so automation is the best for this, right? We often laugh about things like friends don't let friends use Excel for transport control. Okay, well, friends don't let friends use SharePoint for workflow, okay? It's not designed for that kind of problem. What we really need is a rich workflow engine that will automatically determine what the next step in the release process should be or the change process should be, automatically make sure that all of the rigor and all of the requirements for getting to the next point in that process have been met, automatically be able to then notify the individuals that are involved in that next process. Of course, be able to keep everybody in their lane in terms of you've got segregation of duties, you've got proper documentation around making sure that people aren't acting outside of their particular role in a given flow. And of course, then the flexibility, because one actor may participate in one aspect of a workflow and a change type in one situation and a completely different one in another, right? So what we're looking for in a solution here, and this is as true of DevOps as it is DevSecOps, is something that provides that consistent rigor and that consistent implementation of process to make sure that change is always performed in the same way and not done so with so much overhead that it becomes onerous to be able to keep the organization in line, right?
Yeah, and I know that there's a number of kind of specific areas, as I said, we've got some quite broad headings here, but even, things like the risk guard analyzer in our active control product, that allows you to identify certain objects or certain types of change that are considered to be risky and need extra validation or extra checks, and certainly those kind of things could play into, the security considerations at a more granular level. So quite a high level title here, kind of a big bucket, but lots of ways that different detailed analysis and process can play into that idea of keeping your system secure. So next up, we've got this idea of code quality. And again, you mentioned quality already, something that I'd have thought you'd definitely want to consider as you think about application security. And there's not much on this slide, but I know a couple of these bullets are actually really important to some of our customers as they think about these topics that we're talking about. So tell us a little bit about what SAP DevOps Automation does for us in this area of code quality around these things that are on the screen.
Yeah, so this probably has a couple of plays in this whole story. One, code quality is obviously paramount to making sure that you don't have outage or other adverse outcome from a given change. But code quality could also imply things like security analysis of the code change itself that's being made, making sure that unit testing is performed consistently, making sure that peer review is always performed with rigor. One of the most common things that we see here is integration with tooling like Anapsys or tooling like ATC or Code Inspector for ABAP change. And so, of course, those solutions are looking for common coding mistakes and other things that might allow you to do accidental things like SQL injection or other hackable tricks to make sure that the change that you're delivering into your production environment is of a higher quality from a security perspective. What we should do in that situation, getting back to the previous slide talking about automation, we should make sure that these analyses are always run. We should make sure that we can document and perfectly demonstrate that we haven't skipped any steps in the process of making a change that might introduce exposure to the organization, either in the form of business continuity or just outright technical defect, making security a problem. So typically what we'll do, and this is again a perfect example of integration in a DevOps environment, is these steps are probably done by a peer before the code even leaves the dev system and makes it into QA, right? So does the workflow engine ask, is the developer not allowed to review their own code? Did I actually execute all of the external integrations and internal systems that I have for evaluating the software change and making sure that it's going to have the same rigor that any other change that we're making in this organization would have? And this is just, again, one of many little chips that we throw into this pile in order to help improve the quality of our change each time.
Yeah, and I guess, it plays into kind of that idea of the centrality of automation in DevOps or DevSecOps as a topic. Code inspectors there, ABAP units there, they could be run in a manual process, but how do you enforce that? How do you make sure it's happened? How do you prove it? Is very much the kind of thing we're trying to build into this automated cycle that we have in DevOps and DevSecOps.
How do you automatically collect all the documentation and make sure it was done and demonstrate to the organization that you did it? Absolutely.
Well, we're gonna come to that in a second. But next up, let's talk about something that you have touched on already as well, is this idea of access and permission segregation of duties. And we know that a lot of security exploits in the world generally are, they're driven by people being able to get into places they're not supposed to or doing things they shouldn't be allowed to do. And naturally letting people make changes to what are typically quite business critical SAP systems, production systems, comes naturally with a pretty significant security risk in allowing that to happen and giving people the responsibility for that. So how can we manage that more effectively without slowing down that speed and that cadence that we're looking for with DevOps in general?
I mean, we should start at a high level by saying that segregation of duties is just good practice, right? We don't want developers allowed to make change in production. We don't want QA allowed to rewrite code that the developer produced. I mean, there's a reason why we have roles, and there's a reason why we keep our activities independent in the organization. And if for no other reason, it's just to help prevent accidental mistakes in other systems where someone might not have the full context and understanding of the environment that they're in. So one of the neat things about really good DevOps tooling is it will go ahead and automate this work. It will simply not allow an incorrect actor to perform or record change or approve or do any of those other activities at a given point in the workflow where they're not specifically authorized to do so, right? And so this salvages all kinds of potential errors that might happen, everything from an accidental approval to someone even doing it specifically adverse, trying to cause grief, right, like that, right? So being able to implement this, being able to wrap this around the workflow, and being able to then enforce and document the true segregation of duties is a very important part of this. Our security professionals will immediately recognize this. They are much better practitioners of this kind of thing than the rest of us tend to be, but it all fits in, and it all works together as part of the story.
Okay, well, I can imagine, and I know this is a capability we have. You might want to cascade that even down from the permissions at a general level in the SAP system, which maybe is already managed by those security teams rather than the people responsible for SAP change. So we can certainly connect the two there. But that does bring us on to something. I think maybe we've covered this already. We've talked about it a couple of times, but the importance of audit and compliance and that trail of change when we think about security. And I guess maybe even in DevSecOps, if we're being more security focused, we might have some maybe new policies or processes that amplify the importance of this topic. So just summarize for us what we get from this kind of automated DevOps process around audit when it comes to DevSecOps, Jim.
Well, implemented correctly, the process would be self-documenting. Every single change, every single touch, every single approval, every single movement would all be part of the audit history and change history for anything that was done in the organization. And so when I think of audit, there's really kind of two parts of it, right? One is keeping track of everything that's been done in an environment and making sure that all of the changes are well documented, and it's easy to get to this information in terms about, especially if something does go sideways later, being able to back up and understand who was involved and how they were involved in these sorts of things. And that's certainly very important. But I think one of the things that we forget around security topics is that the documentation of this stuff is very onerous and expensive in terms of human capital. So if we could use automation to get this right consistently, if writing release and audit reports were as simple as requesting it from the underlying system, what kind of value would that bring the organization to not be tracking this stuff manually and not have those potential exposures in terms of audit and compliance reporting? And so, now we're just essentially having a financial argument, but I think it is a very important part of the story because audit is expensive.
Okay, well, that is one final technical point that was on my list about change control supporting DevSecOps, and that's the idea of tool chain integration. A couple of times, it's a big topic. We have whole webinars on it, so we're not going to solve for this in today's session, but just how important is this question in DevOps for SAP and in particular for DevSecOps? Is there anything different we need to think about there?
Well, let's talk about why integration is a requirement and a thing now. SAP rarely lives on an island. In almost every customer that I'm in, of course, SAP is the system of record. Of course, it's the system of business process. It's an absolutely essential part of how organizations execute and run every day, but it's not the only system in the environment. And it is extremely common today to be able to have multiple different tools that do maybe certain elements of business functionality, say materials management versus warehouse management versus sales and distribution, those kinds of things. And you want to be able to make sure that all those systems work together because you might not be using SAP for absolutely everything, right? Well, in that context, if I'm making a change in an environment and it's got dependencies on the back end, I need to be able to orchestrate that change across multiple systems at the same time. This is a time-honored CI/CD problem. It's been well solved for. We do this stuff every day here at Basis. But the same thing is true of security changes. What if I'm restructuring the way I do RFCs? What if I'm restructuring the way that systems communicate with each other through their integration APIs? I better be removing the old system users and the system access points. I better be replacing them with the proper new credentials and authentication strategies and these sorts of things. It's the exact same idea, but now we've introduced this concept of security change. We've introduced this concept of orchestrating change across multiple systems so that it makes sense. So, again, it's the natural evolution of exactly what you would have expected now that we're doing security change as well across multiple different systems.
And from a security perspective, knowing that there may already be teams and processes running different tools, I guess when you've got a layer there, the kind of CI/CD stack like our product active control we can see in this slide, if there's an API for the tools that are already in use, I guess then we've got the facility to connect them and make them part of that automated workflow in the same way as some of the other tools we've described. And I know that's happening with some of our clients already.
It happens every day. I mean, the truth is that change inside of SAP, whether we're talking about transports or security or anything really, is different. It's fundamentally different because it's SAP. And SAP kind of lives in its own world and has its own concepts and those sorts of things. That's fine. What we need is a solution to be able to bridge that delta between the rest of the world and SAP and be able to participate and work with those other tools. I mean, that's what we do here at Basis, right? This is the whole point of that active control layer there, is being able to provide an understanding of what automation needs to be inside of a specific SAP context, but also make it work like software developers are used to outside of SAP already.
Okay, so I think again it's going to be obvious to our audience by this point. We're talking about the importance here of an automated workflow, automating as much as we can and controlling as much as we can to go with that cross-functional team that we started with that includes security. And if we've got the right APIs and the right means to do it, we can absolutely build security tools into that kind of integrated chain. So that gives us a bit of the sort of ideas around the practical aspects of how change control can support security considerations and DevSecOps, but let's take a brief look at a couple of reasons why we might want to do that. First of all, how do those kind of features we've just described practically help SAP teams respond to security issues more quickly and safely still in a DevSecOps process, where we are moving quite fast?
And I'm going to go back to what drove us to end up in DevOps in the first place with this answer, right? If you have something in terms of an urgent change need, maybe there's a new day zero risk if we put it in a security context. But in standard change, we might be realizing a regulatory change or a new business requirement or a competitive differentiator. And that needs to get through the process of becoming available to the business's functionality as quickly as possible, right? But what we don't want to do is create additional risk by dropping all of our rigor, dropping all of the things that we should be doing in order to be able to do this correctly, in order to get that change through. It's sort of like fighting fire with a flamethrower. You don't want to make the whole situation much worse. But by not using good, consistent best practices for every single change that you're trying to make here. So when we introduce automation to this, and we introduce the ability to automate a lot of the onerous asks of being able to do change in a safe way, it gives us that facility that we need to be able to increase the tempo for delivery, but do so without increasing the risk, right? And I would never advise a customer that they should have some parallel transport path, or they should have some parallel change path, that when they get into an emergency, they can go use that back door to be able to get around all of the safety controls that exist for any change in a production environment. I would never advocate for that. What I would advocate for is for them to be able to have a highly efficient system that makes it possible to do it the right way, but do it the right way quickly.
And I guess, part of that is when we do have to push those emergency changes through, when that happens through our rigorous process, then having that automation there to support us with making sure we manage any potential overwrites or overtakes, or we've got the dependencies correctly identified for those emergency fixes we're putting in, so that other things don't break as we go through that process. And that's all part of that kind of DevSecOps approach when we think about change control. And I guess that's more the kind of reactive side of things, right? How can we respond to issues or threats that we've seen? What about the proactive side of things in terms of defending against future risks? Does the DevOps automation help us in that side of things in SAP? And if so, what's it doing for us?
It does so tremendously. If you've joined other webinars that you and I have done, I am a huge advocate of multiple parallel tracks for software development. There's a whole litany of reasons why, but one of the things that parallel tracks allows us to do is it allows us to be able to verify that an update, a patch, a change, and any kind of thing that we're going to do to our production environment is going to be successful. And it lets us do it without having to do a production change freeze, okay? So especially as we start looking at S4, where we're likely to get annual updates, we really do need to be fairly present with what is a fairly expensive upgrade process to the organization, because it's doing lots of things to that production environment. Locking down change in production through the whole test period of being able to apply that upgrade or patch is really, it's not a very good answer. And for many organizations, it's just simply impossible, right? They already have changed so frequently that the course of an upgrade cycle is going to be too long to lock down production. So the classic challenge, though, of having that parallel track is, how do I make sure that I don't accidentally reintroduce regression at cutover when during the course of verifying this upgrade, this patch, this change, whatever it is I'm doing, I did have to do some production support work. And this is where active control will help our customers solve for that problem, right? Because it's going to handle all your automatic retrofitting. It's going to make sure that both existing production support and your parallel landscape stay in perfect sync the whole time. And then at the same time, it's going to give you that parallel environment to be able to go, I'm going to say leisurely upgrade it, leisurely test it, have extraordinarily high confidence that the cutover is going to be successful, and yet not have disrupted production and not frozen production on the path to get there. I can't say enough good about parallel tracks. I think it is absolutely the right way to do these kinds of things. And it's going to make patching a whole lot easier. Yeah, I think the days of talking to customers that are on ECC and they're still at SP0, that's not going to be practical as we move forward, for lots of reasons that we've talked to, right? The fact that SAP is no longer so standstill or standalone, and the fact that it's being upgrades are being released so frequently. So this is an approach that can really make a big difference for a customer.
So it sounds like the key here, as much as anything, is trying to provide the means to remove that calculus of, is it worth the effort it's going to take us to apply that patch on Patch Tuesday or to implement that upgrade? We know it's important, but is it important enough? Well, if our process is automated, is efficient, has massively reduced that resource requirement, then obviously it's going to be a much easier decision to make, and that's going to help to keep the business safer.
I think that's a wonderful question to ask, and we know that customers have avoided doing upgrades specifically because of that reason. So let's lower the threshold, let's lower the cost of the upgrade and keep them present. Absolutely.
Okay, well, thanks, Jim. Well, we're getting towards the end, a little bit tight for time. So before we wrap up, as promised, we're just going to take a very quick look at a real SAP DevOps story where automation has supported an organization in managing SAP change differently. I'm going to run through this quite quickly, but we do have more details about it on our website. So the customer in question here is Interpublic Group, one of the biggest advertising companies in the world. And as I say, if you're interested more in this story, we have a recorded webinar and a case study available on our website. You can get into the details, but just a quick high-level description of where they were. This is an organization that centrally uses SAP to support different agencies, companies, brands in many different countries around the world in a very disruptive and digitally dynamic environment with a lot of new players like Google and Facebook. So they were really challenged to respond to the needs of those different parts of the business more quickly and effectively. As you can see here, they had this agency demand for more agile IT, whilst maintaining that strict legal compliance, not so much about security, but certainly that legal compliance in this aspect that they needed, and they adopted DevOps in SAP to help them do that. They adopted active control from Basis Technologies as the kind of platform to provide the automation they needed. And in doing so, over a series of projects in which they gradually scaled out the implementation of DevOps across their team to prove those benefits, they managed to successfully adopt a DevOps approach in their SAP systems. And one of the core outcomes and benefits of that is that they've moved from biannual production releases of new functionality into their systems to weekly SAP releases. So obviously they can be much more responsive to what the business needs. And in doing that, they've been able to really lower the cost of change, increase their visibility, and increase the quality of their releases, all the kind of things that we've talked about in today's session, so that they could better support the business. And we'd expect, you know, if they were to layer security as a more specific concern into their approach here and maybe call it DevSecOps, you know, they'd see even more benefits along the same kind of lines. But naturally, as part of the process that they've adopted for DevOps for SAP, they're doing some of these things that we've already talked about in today's webinar. So as I say, very quick intro to the success of DevOps for SAP at Interpublic Group at IPG, but if you'd like to know more, do please have a look for that on our website. And just to wrap up, oh, doing it again, don't know what's going on with my computer today. Just before we wrap up, just to kind of touch on the benefits of aligning SAP change control with a DevSecOps approach. You know, you can see on the screen here some of the kind of outcomes that our customers see after they adopt DevOps automation technology, a product active control. So we're talking about the same topics we've had through all of today's webinar: getting change to production more quickly, more safely, at a lower cost, and these are exactly the kind of benefits you'd see in a DevSecOps approach as well, perhaps with even more benefit around security and uptime and quality than even you typically see when you're using DevOps automation. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. A little bit quick at the end there just to wrap up for time, but let's just quickly recap what we've covered. We talked about how DevSecOps is really just an evolution of DevOps in SAP or anywhere else actually, and it's about bringing security into those cross-functional teams and thinking about that from day one as a specific concern. And we've looked at how change control automation supports many of the goals we might have in a DevSecOps approach, in a more security-minded approach, and some of the specific ways that automation can support that, particularly in SAP. And we also just very briefly there looked at the end with that customer example at how DevOps and DevSecOps can really provide value to SAP teams today. So just remains for me to say, before we just have a quick look at some Q&A that's come in, thank you to everybody for joining us here on today's webinar. As I mentioned, it's a recorded session. We will be sending out the link, so do look out for that. If you'd like to discuss any of this in more detail, or you have any questions, you can get in touch with us either via our website or with Jim directly using the details that are on the screen here. So once again, thanks very much for joining us in today's session. Just going to quickly take a look at the questions that have come in. Bear with me a second while I do that. Let's see. One second. So Jim, while I just take a look at these, why don't we start with what I think is a relatively easy one, and I hope is clear to our audience from the session already. But the question was, would you recommend we start with DevOps or with DevSecOps?
Yes, because they are so similar, right? I think what any customer should look at is adopting the idea of iterative incremental change, being able to deliver that with a consistent rigor and consistent process frequently to benefit the business more often, and then putting automation tooling behind that to implement that process so that you don't make accidental mistakes, you have lower human error, you have less human requirements in terms of the effort that you put into it. You know, all the benefits that we know from this technological and methodological approach. What the underlying change is, to me personally, is not so important. It could be a code change, it could be a security roles change, it could be a patch and upgrade. I'm not sure it matters. I think the point is that we look at this better process, this better way of doing change, and we adopt that strategy. And then what the change is, well, let's just pick the low-hanging fruit within the organization and go tackle for a small iterative problem first.
Okay, we've got a couple of quite specific questions that have come in, but let's try and cover a couple of them in the time we've got left. Besides active control, what other products fall in the DevOps for SAP category? I think that's kind of an interesting question. What's your thoughts on that one?
Well, I think we start to break this down into small little pieces though. But active control obviously is going to be your CI/CD pipeline. It's going to provide the facilities and the orchestration of change across the SAP landscape and the movement of transports and all that necessary mechanical automation in order to be successful doing these kinds of things. When you ask a question like, what other tools exist in this space, we start to have to break down the different roles of the CI/CD pipeline into different bits, right? So if we're talking about business requirements, which is typically called backlog management, when you're organizing the changes that you would make, putting them into themes, putting them into sprints, things like that. Even though active control can do that, I'd say probably 80% of my customers don't use active control for it. They use Jira, they use ServiceNow, they're using Raleigh, they're using some other backlog manager because they have change that exists in more than SAP that is in concert, right? That needs to be orchestrated together. And we could go pick apart backlog management versus CI versus CD and probably name any number of little bits along the way where other types of tooling might make sense in that pipeline. And I think we even had a presentation on this called an integrated tool chain or something like that, another webinar where we actually did break down into some of those ideas. So great question, a fairly detailed question to really get into, but feel free to reach out to me and I'd love to start that dialogue and conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think just to layer on top of that, from my point of view, the key is that is having that platform to manage that integrated process, as you've mentioned, across those different tools, across your delivery cycle. So, and that's really the role that part of the role that active control is playing and adding value through there. And that also covers another one of our questions, which is around whether ServiceNow is required in the kind of process we've talked through today. And just to reiterate what Jim has said there, it's certainly not required. It's an option. It's a tool that many of our customers are now adopting or considering, and we can certainly build that into a DevOps or DevSecOps process as part of that tool chain as we go through. Let's see, we've got another question here. I'll just paraphrase this, but in the context of DevSecOps, the question is asking particularly about S4. What's the typical kind of release cycle that we might see in that kind of process, and how has active control supported that, Jim?
So release is an overloaded term in that question. There's the release of S4 itself, the underlying platform that comes from SAP. And I think it's on a roughly annual cycle at about this time, right? Now, the other concept of a release might be how frequently you produce change that you push forward into production in your own environment, right? And that's going to be a function of your organization. I have customers that do this multiple times daily. They're literally transporting change multiple times a day. And I have customers that are still on more lengthy release cycles, say, monthly. But one of the things that is a common theme that we see when customers adopt DevOps technology and adopt solutions like active control, the tempo of release accelerates considerably. It is completely ordinary to see biannual release become monthly. It is completely ordinary to see monthly release become weekly, these kinds of changes. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I mean, I know from personal experience and the conversations I've had that we actually have numerous customers now who are happily managing daily releases into production systems because they've got an automated tool chain with things like active control in it. Doesn't necessarily mean their cycle times in terms of development work are massively shorter, but typically that is what we tend to see as well. Just running up against time here, we've gone a little bit over because we've had a few questions that have come in, so apologies to anyone whose question I didn't get to, but just last one I want to cover because it plays into a couple of the answers you've already given, Jim. And it's a product that comes up quite a lot in recent times. If Azure DevOps is used for work management for SAP, what's the best practice around whether change should be created in active control or in Azure DevOps? Any recommendation around that? And I think you've already touched on this with your previous answer.
Well, I did and I didn't. I'm glad to see this question. This is a great question. So let's talk about what Azure DevOps is really good at. It's got a backlog manager built into it. It's very good for keeping track of requests for change, organizing that backlog, deciding what's going to be in a given sprint, planning your change. It has all of that kind of tooling. But it also has the concept of a pipeline. So it has the concept of a build or a CI/CD pipeline where it would actually produce the output result of a developer having done their programming and having done their work and then produce the executable from it. Now, what Azure DevOps can't do very well is understand how to make change work in SAP. It has no concept of 3 or 4 tier architectures. It has no concept of a transport. It has absolutely no idea what objects are, workbench transports versus configuring transports and all of these kinds of things. So when I'm working with customers that have this mixed medium that they need to manage across both, what I advise is let's use the agile tooling that makes sense for the broader enterprise to do backlog management and to do change outside of SAP. And let's use active control to manage the change once it's essentially been assigned to an ABAPer and becomes or will become a transport. Now, the integration capabilities and active control with Azure DevOps are especially robust. It is completely conceivable that you would approve testing, for example, in active control. It would automatically update the Kanban board in Azure DevOps and would move the appropriate and associated transports from, let's say, dev to QA or QA to pre-prod, and all of that would be reflected back into Azure DevOps so that the appropriate changes outside of SAP, say maybe a web services build or something like that, could also be executed and moved in parallel between the environments that are outside of SAP. So that's a great question. It's something that we see increasingly more common, actually quite frequently anymore. And that's how I would divide it, is let the tools that know what a transport is basically do that kind of work. And then let's use Azure DevOps as you would for other types of change in your organization.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Jim. Just checking my watch here again because we're a little bit, as I've said, over time. So thanks again to everybody who's joined us today. Apologies to anybody whose question we didn't get to. We'll try and cover those off with you offline after the session. Do please take a look at our website for future webinars and a lot of past content up there as well. And we hope to see you on another Basis Technologies webinar very soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.